I started collecting plastic objects, including balloons, and decided to work around that theme. My first work was actually photographs of concepts, where I manipulated the images to represent what I thought, or I think that the landscape will look like 100 years from now, after being dramatically affected by pollution. And after that work, I started using the balloons to create these seascapes, the work that is now on view at the Heckscher. So yes, Long Island definitely has had a big impact in this last 18 months on my work.
Okay, fantastic. And we will be diving into that a little bit later today. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think, Lauren, I wonder if you could share about your connection to Long Island.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Long Island. I grew up in Islip Terrace and just recently moved to Bellport. And I mean, up until recently, I don't think that Long Island really has played too much of a role in my practice. In past works, I think like the socioeconomic disparities between communities that are in close proximity has definitely influenced the way I look at certain things in my work. But Long Island as a place really hasn't played a part up until recently. And I think that was definitely influenced by, of course, during the pandemic, kind of being stuck here and just being looking a lot more at local issues. So I had originally started a project at the beginning of, I guess, the lockdown or the shutdown in March that tracked the amount of positive COVID cases in Suffolk County. And I believe I started when we only had like 200 or so. So I had to kind of abandon that project because it kind of got too overwhelming at one point. But I think that this idea of looking locally in my research kind of stuck. And I had been working on a project incorporating the idea of the Wunderkammer or the Cabinet of Curiosities back in January. And I think these two ideas just kind of came together in a way where I wanted to incorporate this form that has a rich history of collection and the aesthetics of science, and kind of incorporate that with research I was doing locally from the research facilities that were in closer proximity to where I was living. So I started looking more at Cold Spring Harbor, Brookhaven National Labs, and Plum Island Research Center. So.
Okay, awesome. And we will also be delving into that in a little bit. But I would like to know, Thomas, if you could share a bit about your connection to Long Island. Thomas, can you hear me okay? Yep, I see that you're muted. There you go. Okay.
Okay. So my connection to Long Island, I've lived on Long Island for most of my life. I was born in New York City, and Long Island is a very close proximity to New York. I'm in Western Nassau County, so it allows me to get into the city. It also allows me to get to an airport that has international connections. But where I am makes a big difference because Long Island is a beautiful place. It's an island that's got a lot of inspiring scenery, landscapes, and I've been painting Long Island as well as the city and a lot of places that I travel to. But Long Island has the best of everything, and it's something that has kept me here for many years. I work on Long Island. I teach in a couple of the local colleges on Long Island. So it's a place that has a great draw. It's also where I grew up. So I have a lot of friends and family that I would never consider leaving. It's one of the greatest places in the world to live. So I find my subject matter around me, wherever I might be. And it's a place that I have to have a personal connection to, and I have to be in that landscape in order to work from motifs, whether it's Long Island or paintings on location, or nearby Bronx, or the other painting that's in the show, Mexico City, which I had visited several times. That's my connection to Long Island. Thank you.
Okay, great. So far we've got a lifelong Long Islander, an almost lifelong Long Islander, and then a newcomer. So Howie, what about you?
Well, I've lived on Long Island for 33 years in the same house, and about 90% of my photographs are of Long Island. And I deliberately go out and explore different parts of Long Island, almost on a random basis, and try to squeeze some art out of it. And I'm always looking for new areas or revisiting areas that I've been to. It's really amazing how one can see a place, not be inspired by it, and then go back to that same place at another time, maybe with different lighting conditions or different weather conditions, and find something interesting to photograph. So yeah, Long Island is really my home for photography. And whether it's the detailed work of this or broader architectural or landscape subjects, like I said, the vast majority of my work is from Long Island. I've been to other places, obviously, and taken some pictures, and it's a lot easier to get pictures in certain other locations. I always say that if you go to Paris, you can just hold your camera up anywhere and find a great picture. Not true of Long Island, but it's still a wonderful place to take photographs, and that's what I do.
Okay, wonderful. So I would like to move now to some more specific questions about each of your work. And I want to start with Lauren and David, because I see some commonalities in your work, and that you both have an engagement with the environment and the natural world. And then you are also both working with what I would call non-traditional art materials. And I'm interested in that. So David, you mentioned that you make use of found balloons, which I think really sets up a surprise for the viewer. It was surprising to me. And it's interesting because I usually associate balloons with celebrations and cheer. They're buoyant, they're shiny, they're colorful, these kind of positive things. But then as soon as I think about them in the landscape, that impulse totally changes. I almost like recoil from that idea. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you if you could speak. I mean, you introduced a bit about your experience on that first walk. And so I wonder if you could tell us more about your process. And also if how do you work with the texture, the color of balloons formally, and kind of work that into this larger question of ecology and the environment.
Okay. So I've been, for the most part, my work has always dealt with consumerism and all issues around that. And I've always worked for doing photography-based work. This is actually the first time that I'm using or presenting my work as a non-photographic medium. And my work, or my photography-based work, was done in studio for the most part. I used to either build up a set and photograph, or photograph objects and then do some computer manipulation, but the presentation was always photographed. So this new body of work, it's definitely a departure from that in terms of the medium that I'm using, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, because I felt a little bit limited with what the photography medium was offering me or allowing me to do it. So this, I've been collecting now plastics and many balloons for about 18 months. And I would say 80% of those materials I've been collecting at ComSat. But it's in a area that goes, where I do most of my drives. It can go between Glen Cove to all the way to Huntington, because I find many balloons as I drive around, and if I have the chance to stop, I'll do it, or if I have the time to come back later on and get the balloon, I'll do it. Many times there's balloons I cannot get it because they are not reachable, they are on the top of the tree or somewhere in the water. But I mean, just so people have an idea, and that was a big surprise for me, I think I've collected close to 200 balloons over this time. And there's many other more that I was not able to collect just because of the reasons that I've just told you. So I think that really shows of the biggest, how big this issue really is. Mm-hmm. And if you just think that this is a very small geographic area, if you just multiply that for, around the world, you probably can imagine that there's thousands, if not millions of balloons that are released into the environment every year. So this, I mean, it has become a very important issue on my work. And the way I try to bring up that, that theme or create some awareness for that is to actually use those pollutant materials, those objects, and create my artwork with. I think there's, in my opinion, there's some parallelism between the balloon as an object and the artwork that I'm doing. The balloon as an object, like you rightly said, is it's a pleasant object. It's shiny, it's colorful, you can take any shape. Generally, for the most part, it's used to celebrate something good. But that's one of the characteristics of the balloon until it's released into the sky, to the environment. Mm-hmm. As soon as it's released, it transitions from something positive, while we can see it going up, and then when it disappears, it becomes something hazardous and something very negative that can disrupt the environment, can actually kill other species, and who knows, maybe even poison humans if it gets into the water and food system. So the balloon as an object has this duality of a positive thing and a negative thing. And so I think that translates into the work that I'm doing as well. When you look at the pieces, they take those qualities of the balloon. I mean, they are made with balloons. They have those very bold colors. They're very shiny, and they there's some texture into it. But it's part of the process, the gluing of that. But so in general, I think they are appealing because of the colors. But the message that they are trying to come across with, present, it's a negative one. It's the one that shows how the environment will look like 100 years from today, when pollution like plastics and balloons will alter the environment so drastically that the sky, the water, and land will take the colors of the actual pollutants. I mean, and there's some examples that we've seen, I'm sure you've heard over the years, of examples that they're facts that kind of substantiates this idea a little bit, such as an oil spill that turns the ocean black, or the land black. There's oil spills on land also, or a yellow smog in Bangkok, or most recently this year, there was a chemical spill in a river in Russia that turned the river crimson. So all these natural colors are kind of sporadically already happen here and there around the world. So, I mean, if there's no, it's just this idea that if it's not contained and reduced, that eventually one day it would alter it on a daily basis, the environment. And landscapes would look like the way I'm trying to present them now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's so fascinating. And I before I looked on your Instagram, I was going to ask you, I had imagined that it would be pretty rare to find these balloons, but you know, I see that that's not true.
That's what I thought. But I've been endless times to ComSat where I've found most of the balloons. And every time I go there, I'm surprised as how many balloons I can find there and balloon strings, besides other plastics. There was a little break during the pandemic because people were not out and about as usual. So actually the amount of plastics that came ashore almost disappeared completely. And I mean, that was a good thing, but I think it's back to how it was before. I'm finding a lot of polluted plastics.
Wow. I wanted to turn now to your work, Lauren, because I have a similar, actually, kind of attraction and fascination, but also apprehension around your work. So when I encounter your work, there are some things that I recognize right away, like test tubes. I can recognize little compartments for organizing specimens. You know, I can see the metal implements. So I know we're kind of in the realm of the biological sciences or the life sciences. And so I'm interested, I'm fascinated, but at the same time, I'm a little apprehensive and nervous about these things. So I wonder if you would be willing to unpack your work for us a bit and share more about what we're looking at and how these objects within your little mini Cabinet of Curiosities speak to some of the laboratories that you mentioned in your introduction. And then I'm also, you know, but I also recognize that maybe you don't want to explicate, you know, every little thing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, my work over the past few years has kind of revolved around ideas of nature. What is nature? How do we relate to nature? Plastic pollution and the relationship to the human body, or other ecological crises that we kind of come across every day. And as I'd mentioned earlier, I'd always kind of wanted to incorporate this form, the form of the Wunderkammer, because it really kind of was the birth of the museum, and this like collection of specimen or object or artifact for display. So when they began, it was more just this, they were rooms more than cabinets, first of all. And they were for these wealthy white men, obviously, who could travel to these places, far off places, and, you know, collect specimen, you know, natural specimen, you know, found jewelry, rocks, objects, animals, whatever they could find, and then bring them back and then put them on display as a way of like telling a story of their travels or of their discoveries and whatnot. So these objects were kind of stand-ins for images, or stand-ins for something to kind of show wealth and access and privilege of worldly things. So my interest in that, of course, was about this idea of display and the history of science, but also this idea of privilege of travel, of privilege of exploration, and privilege of discovery. So I kind of wanted to insert myself into that conversation, and also into the conversation of, or the history of the Wunderkammer in contemporary art, because it has been done over and over within contemporary practices. Mm-hmm. And so, with that being said, I kind of wanted to, going off of what you had said, Karli, with where you're drawn in, but also kind of apprehensive. I'm trying to piece together actual like research that has been done that kind of looks at the complexities of the relationship between the public and these institutions, or different scientific institutions For example, looking at, let's say, the test tubes that are pictured on the left, they are water samples that are kind of stand-ins for the BNL groundwater protection group water samples that show the amount of the safe level of toxicants that are allowed in our tap water. And I think that was really interesting because sometimes you look at these things and you think, oh, you know, this is really frightening or whatnot. But actually what's really scary is what's allowed. And I didn't have to go far to get these samples. They were from my tap water, you know? So to see like what's allowed in our environment from certain institutions, it's kind of unsettling. And it's also not only a conversation between the public and these institutions, it's different scientific institutions, right? So we have physicists working against environmentalists to see like the hierarchy of these practices and like where they lie in relationship to one another. So I have stand-ins for tests from BNL. I have the surgical tools that are relating to the Cold Spring Harbor eugenics tests of the early 1900s. And what else do we have in there? We have a lot of good stuff. And then I have some, what are they called? The slides. Yeah, sorry. The slides that are relating to the Plum Island Animal Disease Center and these conspiracies, whether who knows what actually happens, right? That they were creating biological warfare viruses there. And I thought that was actually really interesting at the time of the pandemic and what people were saying where viruses were coming from. So it's all kind of mixing myth and truth and where fact kind of meets fear in the public sphere and kind of presenting that in a form that speaks to the history of these institutions.
Thank you very much. I have no doubt that we will have more questions about this from our audience today. But I wanted to turn now to the work of Howie and Thomas, because it's interesting. I see parallels between your work as well. So both of you, your work is centering on your individual experiences of place, as you both mentioned, and the built environment and its geometries. And I think you're both involved in different ways with the history of art and its traditions. So I wanted to start by asking you, Thomas, more about, so as you've mentioned, a lot of your work centers on Long Island, but you also travel quite a bit and spend time in other environments. And so what I'm wondering is, to what extent does your work, the composition, the imagery, even the mood of your work change in response to different locations? And then to what extent are there commonalities or kind of constants in your practice, regardless of where you are?
Well, that's a very good question. The composition, the color, and the light are all very dependent on the place. And most of these are started on location. I'll do a sketch, I'll do drawings, sometimes plein air sketches on location, but 100% of my work is executed in the studio. And I come back and paint in my Long Island studio from start to finish from those sketches. So this is a slide of me working on location in Lucca, but the finished work was done on Long Island. After the travel component was done, I came back and did the work. Compositionally, you'll notice these two on the screen are both squares. And I was taught in a graduate school that had a very dominant influence by Joseph Albers, a Bauhaus teacher and the dean of color theory of the 20th century. So using a square, which is the most non-orthodox landscape format, it's something that forces me to address the composition in a very unique way each time. So in using a square, it's something that emphasizes a formalist geometry and architecture is a very strong component of my work, but the more expressive skies allow me to be a lot more expressive with color, with light, and with just free form that results far away from the motif. And it's 100% studio invention. So it's based on experience, and my experiences are then internalized. And when I come back to the studio, I don't know what the painting is going to look like until it's finished and it starts to develop. And it's a long process, but it winds up in a place that I could never have originally planned. And that's the working process. So geometry, formalism, drawing that precedes the painting, color, light, as a starting point.
Wonderful. And I'm curious too, Thomas, because I know that you are very fluent in the history of art. You teach the history of art. And I'm curious to know how that impacts your painting practice. And is it a help? Is it ever a hindrance to kind of have this entire bank of art history knowledge that you carry around with you?
Well, I've always had fondness for art history, and I see myself as painting in a medium that has been exercised for over 500 years, oil paint. So using art history as a passion and a pastime, and also a subject that I teach as much as I teach studio art, painting and drawing. Art history is just something that I use in my arsenal. I don't see it as a hindrance because I'm not imitating a specific artist or a specific work. But when I'm in the studio, I'm away from the museum. I'm away from, there's no art books in my studio. I insist it's that way, but there's a lot of things that creep in through the subconscious that I'm unable to keep out. So a painter like Edward Hopper is very near and dear to me. A painter like Vermeer in The View of Delft is somebody that I think about and would oftentimes have a dialogue with, just in the way that space and some of the formalist elements are developed. But in the end, I think that the painting is only successful if it's a personal work, not derivative from a master from the history of art. So I don't see it as a hindrance as much as something that I use as a dialogue, or I guess knowledge is power in every regard. So it's something that I embrace.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so as you're talking about geometry and personal place, I mean, that kind of, in my mind, connects to Howie's work. So I wanted to ask you, Howie, if we move to that. So your two photos in the biennial, I just want to show both of them here, were both taken at kind of disused places on Long Island. And much as Thomas was saying, I mean, these really kind of, your work flirts with abstraction in a way, or there's this organizing grid, squares, geometry. And that's certainly true in Shape and Shapeless, which I think is such a great title, by the way.
Thank you.
And then also, you know, maybe it's because Halloween is approaching or something, but with this photograph, I have a sense of the uncanny or the surreal even. And so I'm curious to know more about how you came to make each of these images and how they relate to your larger body of work, which, as you said, really encompasses a wide range of subject matter.
Well, first of all, you should know that I am entirely self-taught. I have not a single moment of art education. And I am also constrained, in effect, by the materials that I use, because I am a film photographer to this day. I started that 30 plus years ago, and I haven't changed. There's my dark room right there, various portions of it. And while, you know, most of the world went digital, I stayed in the analog world, and I still, to this moment, use all of these materials here. A lot of chemicals, and there's a lot of science behind all of this. and I shoot film. So I am always looking for things that have a lot of texture, a lot of geometry to them, a lot of light values. This photo, you know, I was obviously struck in this photo by the luminescence of the boards that covered the windows, and also the open, semi-open shade there that sort of indicates that there's something going on beyond the window pane. There really wasn't. It was a deserted plant and flower store out in Mauritius, in the middle of nowhere. And that sense of the old really captures a lot of my work. I'm always looking, what always captures my eye are things that are in disuse or things that have seen better days. It's harder and harder to find that on Long Island, but it's still there if you look in the right places. And yes, geometry is also always a factor. For some reason, my eye is attracted to different shapes and different geometric formulations. And these are two prime examples of that.
Wonderful. And I wanted to ask you briefly, and then this is probably the last question from me, and then we'll open it up to our audience. But I wanted to ask you more about the aspects of that traditional process of film photography and printing in the darkroom, and if there are parts of that, you know, that kind of draw on different strengths. Like, do you have to enter different mindsets? Are there different skill sets involved?
100%. You know, if I see a colorful scene, it might or might not do anything for me in black and white. And I'm always envisioning things, how things will look like in black and white. And obviously I was drawn to this scene because it has all of the shades of gray that you can imagine in it. You know, the pure blacks, the pure whites, and everything in between. And that's very representative of what I'm always looking for. I actually used to have a little lens that you could hold over your eye, and it would translate a color scene into black and white. And it was very effective. But now I can do it by myself, I hope. And so while I'm not adverse to color, it's obviously not what I do. And the materials that I use are deliberate constraints because I like to be artistically challenged to do things that the materials that I use capture in the best way possible. So there you have it. It's really an interesting challenge, and I'm also challenged by the fact that I go to random places on Long Island. I actually have a computer program that generates different areas of Long Island, and I program that into my GPS, and that's how I figure out where to go. And sometimes I find great stuff, and sometimes I find nothing. But I try to make the most of whatever is there and translate it into the black and white medium. I'm governed. I've looked at the photography of every great photographer that's ever lived, and I'm not anywhere close to them. But in my own little world, those are the people that I admire and try to emulate.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's so, you know, this is my first Long Island Biennial, and it's just been so wonderful to me to become more aware of the incredible wealth and range of work being created on Long Island. So thank you all for participating in the Biennial. And I think Carrie will join us back on screen, and she has been collecting everyone's questions. And so she will relay those and we can talk a little bit further.
Yes. I just want to reiterate and what Karli said, and just thank you all for being part of Biennial and part of the conversation. So our first question is to Thomas Germano, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but the question is, can you elaborate on the skies that you paint a little bit more?
And I think we've got him muted. I don't know who. Okay.
Okay. The skies, like the whole painting, are painted from memory. There are no literal references that I'm standing in front of, as skies change way too fast, light changes way too fast to capture it in one moment. I don't use photographs for my skies. I have experienced a million sunsets, and well, maybe not a million, but quite a few. The different light conditions, the different atmospheric conditions, and just drawing from those, the painting develops from memory and from invention in the studio. And getting the right temperature of color and the right light temperature in the architecture as well as in the sky is very important to me. So the warmth of what you might find in the yellow band on the horizon of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, you'll find the same warm colors and warm light on the domes and on the rooftops. There's a dusty, somewhat polluted color in the foreground, which is the light filtering through the atmospheric particles. So it's something that I experienced, breathing in the air of Mexico City, walking through the streets of Mexico City, walking in the ruins of the Aztec capital, which is down below from where I was sitting drawing this subject. It's something which all draws from my memory and from my experiences, but the skies are 100% invented places.
Really interesting. And then the next question, I think, is for all of you. A very basic question, but I really like it. It's just, who's your favorite artist of all time? So David, do we want to start with you?
Well, let's just give him a minute, because that's such a hard question.
Kind of a hard one.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, over time I had a favorite artist. You know, I have either a photographer, because I started with studying photography, or I always envy painters because I think it's such a fantastic medium as well. And I mean, there's many painters I really like their work. But because of the work that I've been doing recently, I'm not saying that I have a one all-time favorite, but like I said, I had different at different times for different reasons. But there's one artist that I really appreciate the work that he's been doing in his career. He's a contemporary artist, and his name is Mark Dion. And maybe Lauren seen or
stole my answer.
Work. And I mean, I think no, I'm sure he has a work now at Planting Fields, which is not very far from the Heckscher. And so I feel a little bit inspired by what he does, even though we do it in a little bit different way. He collects plastics and other man-made materials, not solely plastics, and organize them and presents them just like the Cabinet of Curiosities. He doesn't do too much to them. He just presents them as they are. I collect them, but I'm using them as a raw material where I alter them for my work. But yeah, so Mark Dion is probably the artist that I've been paying more attention lately.
Great. And Lauren, do you want to build on David's answer?
Sure. I don't really know who my favorite of all time is, but the ones I'm looking at now that I'm really interested in, I guess, would of course be Mark Dion, Doreen Garner, who's doing some really interesting things about the history of science right now. She's fabulous. And Fred Wilson, he's up there in like top favorites.
Howie, what about you?
Yeah, it's pretty easy for me. Walker Evans, he is my god, and I would like to be him.
And Tom,
I have a few others: Paul Strand, Andre Cortez, Margaret Brooke White, those people.
I was thinking about Paul Strand with this image of yours, Howie, because he's anyway, but
well, I've taken a few shots and then discovered that Paul Strand already did it 70 years ago.
And for me, it would be Leonardo da Vinci. I appreciate the way that he combines science and the visual arts, and all things are interrelated in Leonardo's works, from the drawing to learn and learning to draw. That interconnection between all living organisms is something that's fascinated me about Leonardo da Vinci.
Great.
Well, we could do a whole panel like part 2 where we
Right.
bring in images of all these things. Oh.
Our next question is for David. This attendee says she's so glad that you're highlighting the problems of balloons on Long Island beaches. She too has been documenting these at her local beach with her iPhone. Her question is, have you thought of using your art to lobby for a balloon ban?
It's a good question. I mean, personally, I don't consider myself an activist, someone that is out there trying to reach people. I try to do that through my work. I hope that brings some awareness for the issues. I mean, through my life, I kind of experienced that the individual effort to change things when it comes to pollution and recycling, it's not enough. I mean, it's good that everybody makes an effort, but in the overall scheme, it's not enough. I think the changes have to come from federal, state, and local authorities. Only through legislation things will change, because, like I said, I mean, I take care of, I recycle, I try to be ecological conscious, but there's a lot of other people who don't, and it just balances off everything all the time. So I'm not planning to use this work to approach anyone in particular in regards to this issue, but I hope that yes, it does create some awareness.
Great. And go ahead.
Oh, well, no, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, I had another question, but go ahead if you have a response.
No. Let's have one more question, and then I was going to ask, for anybody's final thoughts, and then my final thought to follow up on David's would be, let's all remember to vote.
Right.
But go ahead, other question.
Okay. Final question. This is for Howie. Can you select one photographer who has influenced you the most? I guess you would say Walker Evans. But...
That's what I would say, yeah.
Right. Okay, great.
So did anybody have any closing thoughts, or shall we leave it there and say good night to everyone?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, my closing thought is thank you for having us. It was a great experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. I would like to thank Karli and all of you as well for sharing your time and insight with us. And thank you also to the audience for tuning in. And just a reminder that we have 2 more of these panel conversations coming up on November 19th and December 3rd, if you'd like to join us. So visit our website and you can register. And again, as a reminder, the Long Island Biennial is on view at the museum through January 10th. So please stop in, register online and check it out.
Thanks, everyone. It was good to see you without the mask. And
Same here. Thank you.